Hi, everyone. We're here to talk about AP US government and politics, and tonight we're going to be delving into talking about the committee system, which is a huge part about when we're talking about how a bill becomes law, which will be next week. You're going to see that committees really play a huge role in all of that. So just to get us started, here are all of our social media links at Think Fiveable on Twitter, on Instagram, and then on YouTube as well. So always feel free to connect with us on any of those. If you have questions, comments, sharing of anything, please feel free to definitely connect with us in all those social media outlets. Just laying out for you some of the things we're going to be talking about tonight. We're going to go into the structure of the committee system. We're going to go into the different types of committees, and then we're also going to talk about subcommittees as well. And we're going to finish it up by talking about how people are assigned to committees to begin with, and just what is exactly the power of committees, because that's a really important concept to understand. So just to get started, we're going to talk about the structure of the committee system itself. You'll see that most of the actual work of policymaking is performed by the committees and then the subcommittees that are a part of Congress. And you'll see that both our House of Representatives and our Senate both have their own committees, and then there'll be joint committees as well, and we'll get into all of that. But the whole purpose of committees, it's really impossible for any one congressperson to really stay informed on everything that possibly can arise in Congress, right? Because if you think about it, our Congress is responsible for making all the laws in our country, whether it's healthcare, education, criminal justice reform, immigration. That's a lot of different topics. And so the whole point of the committee system is to kind of provide specialization in a sense. So Congress people can really specialize in certain topics, either that might be of interest to them, or maybe they have some sort of background in it from their prior education or the prior job they had before becoming a congressperson. And then committee systems too, it's also a great way to divide labor. Policies and bills, they're sometimes 100 pages, could even be up to 1,000 pages long. So you really need help getting through all that, making sure you're doing thorough enough research on these bills and these pieces of legislation to make sure all of us, as their constituents, all of our needs are being met. And so committees really help to divide that labor up. You're going to see that the way the process a bill takes to become a law, how quickly it may or may not get done, really depends upon how quickly it can get through the committee system. And some committees you'll see might purposely slow down a bill to drag it out a little bit, whereas sometimes you'll see some bills might get fast-tracked, so to speak, and they'll move through the committee system a little bit quicker. And that's really going to be determined by the chairperson of the committee. And again, that's something we're going to get into a little bit later in this presentation. There are over 200 committees and subcommittees currently in our Congress. So that's including both the House and the Senate together. Basically, the role of committees, you're going to see they sometimes are there to legislate, meaning make laws. Sometimes they're there for oversight, meaning looking over and checking some of the things that have taken place. Sometimes it's just simple internal administrative tasks that committees are there to do. But for the most part, it's really that legislative portion that we're seeing committees work. And they're really looking for, what are the best policies for this issue that we have at hand. They're going to identify those different policy problems. They're going to look at and talk about possible solutions to the policy problems. And then they're really going to report back to the House and to the Senate about what their recommendations might be. Oversight, which I just mentioned, that's another part of committees. And that's something, if we have time at the end, we could really delve into, especially everything that's kind of breaking in the news. Because oversight is where you're really monitoring the executive branch, you're investigating allegations of wrongdoing, and that's currently what's taking place in 6 of our committees in the House of Representatives. So again, oversight is usually a smaller portion of committees. It's usually legislation, that's the biggest part, but we're seeing right now that oversight is kind of all over the news because of everything that's taking place. And if we have time, for sure, at the end of this, we can kind of jump into talking about what exactly that means. The 1946 Legislative Reorganization Act, this basically set the framework for the committee system that we have today in our country. Basically what it does is it organizes the Senate and House committees, so they're almost parallel in a sense, but we are going to see that there's been changes over time. So when we later on talk about like some of the standing committees, you'll see that the House and the Senate have very similar standing committees with slight divergences because of changes that have taken place over time. And those changes are really just because the Senate and the House have their own rules, and they're able to adopt different rules along the way, which might change the organization of some of those committees. And again, that's something when we see those standing committees, that's something that'll probably make a little bit more sense. But there are three main types of committees that we're going to be talking about tonight: standing, select, and then joint committees. Before we get into the first type of committee, which is going to be standing committees, does anyone have any questions that I can't answer at this moment in time? All right, so we're all good so far, it seems. All right, thank you. It's nice to get some feedback. All right, so let's get into the fun stuff here of talking about some of the specific committees that there are. So standing committees, these are probably the more well-known of all the different types of committees just because they're permanent committees. So that means no matter if Congress changes from year to year, those standing committees are always going to be there. And they're established by the different rules of each chamber of Congress. They're going to continue, as I said, from session to session. And what we're going to see is that most of these standing committees will actually have subcommittees underneath them. And that's just because they have so much that they need to do within their committee that sometimes it's better if you can specialize even more by dividing it up into subcommittees. Basically, standing committees, they'll consider bills, they'll consider issues, they'll hold hearings on the bills just to get experts in to kind of talk about, okay, if we pass this bill, what might be some of the possible ramifications or consequences that could take place down the road. And they tend to like to hear from both sides of the spectrum, just so they're really getting a full picture of what might happen if that bill goes into place. They also have oversight responsibility, which I was talking about. So they'll monitor different agencies, such as the executive branch. They'll monitor different activities that are taking place, as long as it falls within the jurisdiction of their committee. Most standing committees, if they're recommending that a bill does go to the full House or it does go to the full Senate, they'll also recommend the amount of funding levels that should be present. So for instance, if they want to pass a healthcare bill, they're going to say this is the amount of money that the government's probably going to have to fund in order for this healthcare bill to fully work to the extent that the framers of it intended to. So any type of existing program that's really been passed due to a law, it was the committee that helped mark it up, which is what it's known as when it's going through committee, that kind of said this is the amount of money that needs to go with this bill. Doesn't mean in the end that's the amount of money it's going to get, but it's really the recommendation of the committee that that full House and the full Senate will end up looking at. Each standing committee you're going to see, because we're going to get into looking at all of them, they're given a specific area of legislative policy jurisdiction, which means that you can put people, so there's like a committee for education. So you can put people who have some sort of background in education. Maybe they were former teachers or they studied education in college. And so they can go there and kind of specialize in that area because they'll have an understanding of what our education system needs. Each member of the House will serve on 2 standing committees, except if the member of the House is on the Appropriation, Rules, or Ways and Means Committee. Then they're only going to be on 1 standing committee. The Appropriations Committee, the Rules Committee, and the Ways and Means Committee, they tend to have the highest workload. And so that's why if you serve on that committee and you're in the House of Representatives, that's the only committee you're going to serve on. If you serve on any of the other committees, then you will be serving on 2 committees. With senators, they serve on 2 major committees and then 1 minor committee. And with the senators, there's only 100 of them. So that's why they're going to be serving on more, because you need to make sure all those committees have an equal amount of staff members on them. And so we'll see here, if we're looking at the slide, that in the House of Representatives, there's 20 standing committees altogether. And in the Senate, there's going to be 16 standing committees altogether. And this is just going to give you a breakdown so you can see these are all the House standing committees. So if it's some type of, we've been talking a lot about the trade war. Hopefully in your classes, you've been talking a little bit about the trade war that's going on and the impact it's been having on farmers. And there's been talk about subsidies and ways in which we can help the farmers. All of that would be going through the Agriculture Committee. Homeland Security, that would be a lot of what's going on as far as terrorism. That you're going to see going through Homeland Security. Appropriations or spending bills. So when we're talking about taxes or different things, you're going to see those going through appropriations. You'll see that some of them are lumped together. So science, space, and technology. That's 3 huge topics lumped together. And yeah, those topics can go hand in hand, but there can also be a lot of divergence within those topics. And that's where subcommittees will play such an important role, because you can have subcommittees underneath that might more specifically focus on something specific with space itself or something specific with technology itself. And then the Senate, we said that there's 16 standing committees in the Senate. And so this just gives you an idea of those standing committees that are in the Senate. And again, you'll see that some of them are very similar to the House of Representatives standing committees. Some are a bit different. So for agriculture in the Senate, we see that's agriculture, nutrition, and forestry together. So again, another area where we're going to see why subcommittees are going to be so very important. Also, they lump together in the House, it was just education and labor. In the Senate, we're going to see it's health, education, labor, and pensions. And again, one of the reasons they have to do this is because the Senate has less committees because they only have 100 members. And they do want to make sure they have a fair amount of members on each committee so enough voices are being heard on the different topics that are being discussed. The Judiciary Committee in the Senate, the Judiciary Committee in the House, those are the committees right now that you're hearing a lot about on TV. So the House Judiciary Committee is the one right now that's starting to talk about possible impeachment articles. On the Senate Judiciary Committee, that's the one tonight that they have access to look at that whistleblower complaint that has just been brought to the Capitol. So those members are kind of getting the first look at what that whistleblower complaint actually said. So you see these judiciary committees right now are kind of the main focus of a lot that's going on within our country. Any questions before we move into the next type of committee? Awesome question about whether or not senators and representatives get to choose which committees they are on. So you'll see in the House of Representatives, it's the Speaker of the House that gets to do committee assignments. And then in the Senate, it's going to be the Senate Majority Leader who gets to do committee assignments. They do take into account what they believe the senators and the representatives would want and where they would be best suited. But in the long run, it's really the Speaker of the House in the House, and then it's the Senate Majority Leader in the Senate who get to make those final decisions. But again, they do want people to serve on those committees that have some sort of expertise in those areas. So a lot of times you do somewhat get what you want, but like some of the major committees, everyone a lot of times either wants to be on the Judiciary Committee, the Rules Committee, the Ways and Means Committee, just because those committees tend to be more powerful. And what we end up seeing is that the people that get to serve on those committees tend to be the members of Congress who have been in Congress the longest. You don't tend to see freshman Congress people serving on some of the more powerful committees. Awesome question, though. Thank you for asking that. All right, so let's move into talking about select committees then. So select committees are generally established by a separate resolution, and you're going to see there's, again, select committees in the House and select committees in the Senate. They're basically there to conduct investigations, maybe conduct some sort of research study. Sometimes, but very rarely, they're there to consider measures. A lot of times it's more examining issues that might not examine an issue that doesn't necessarily fit clearly within one of the standing committees that already exists. Sometimes a select committee can be permanent, but for the most part, select committees are temporary. Whatever the issue is, once they're done with it, that committee is just going to disband. The one that we see, there is one caveat to this. There is a select committee on intelligence, and that's in the House of Representatives, and that's been pretty permanent for a few years now. It's been the longest standing select committee that we do have in our country, just because of the fact that intelligence, with everything that started taking place after 9/11, has become so vital to our country's operation that committee has just become more long-standing. And usually select committees don't have subcommittees, but again, that's going to be the one exception to the rule, because it's become such a long-standing select committee that select committee on intelligence does actually have 4 subcommittees tied to it. And a lot of times, select committees, they're not going to be there making legislation. A lot of times, they're just doing research on an issue, whether it's crime. So years ago, in the 80s and 90s, there was a select committee that really looked at crime within our country, looked at gun violence within our country, just because that was an emerging issue at the time. And so that's kind of where the focus was. You'll see that with select committees, again, in the House, there's only going to be one of them, which is the one I mentioned on intelligence. And in the Senate, there's going to be 4 select committees. And we'll just take a peek at what these are. So in the House, the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence is there. And then you'll have the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, which is more the special caveat of a special committee than it is select. And then the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, the fact that Congress needs to kind of rise up with the changing times in our country. And then obviously the climate crisis is a huge topic right now within our country. In the Senate, you have a Select Committee on Aging. So how can we best help the senior citizens within our country? It's their services we should be providing them. There's a caucus on international narcotics control. So looking at the illegal drugs that are pouring into our country and how we can kind of best practices for trying to prevent that. Ethics. Ethics a lot of times looks more at specific Congress people and some of the behavior in which they're engaging in. Indian Affairs is looking at Native Americans within our country, looking at all the treaties we've kind of had with Native Americans throughout the years. Are we honoring those treaties? Where can we better our relationship with different Native American tribes? And then also, the Senate also has a committee on the intelligence as well. So again, after 9/11, our intelligence committee grew tenfold. We used to only have the FBI and the CIA, but then we saw the Department of Homeland Security get created. These 2 intelligence committees get created, just so they can keep abreast of everything that's taking place within our country, and then obviously also internationally, intelligence-wise. Questions? Sorry for my cough. I've been battling this New Jersey weather of hot, cold, hot, cold. Doesn't want to make up its mind. All right, cool. So moving on then to joint committees. This is going to be our 3rd type of committee. Oh, how is the standing different from the standing Homeland Security Committee? Really good question. So the Homeland Security Committee mostly focuses on immigration. That falls under Homeland Security. They'll focus on different things as far as U.S. citizens, whereas the Select Intelligence Committee is focusing more on our international intelligence. So looking at things that are taking place in other countries but might be impacting us. It's very similar to that difference between the CIA and the FBI, which is probably the best way of understanding these 2 committees. Right, so our FBI can only investigate U.S. citizens. They're not allowed to investigate things taking place outside the U.S. It's U.S. citizens they can investigate. So that's kind of like our Homeland Security Committee. Homeland Security a lot of times is focusing on just domestically things that might be taking place here. So looking at our airport security, which we started doing after 9/11, Homeland Security, also FEMA, falls under that. So looking at our responses to hurricanes, natural disasters, whereas the Select Intelligence Committee is somewhat closer to our CIA. Our CIA cannot investigate U.S. citizens. They're not an investigative branch. The CIA, all they can do is gather information about outside citizens, so international folks. And so our Select Intelligence Committee, a lot of times what we see them doing is focusing more on what's going on outside the U.S. border, but could possibly impact us here. And so any relationship we might have with a foreign country, anything in that realm, that's where that Select Intelligence Committee will get involved. And this goes back to like super weird laws that when the FBI and the CIA were established that kept them so separate, which is one of the big problems that I'm sure you all have learned about this that led to 9/11, because the CIA and the FBI were never allowed to really share information because of how separate their work was. So I hope that makes sense as far as the difference between the two. But if you keep in mind the role of the FBI and the CIA, you think of the FBI as the Homeland Security Committee and the CIA more as the Select Intelligence Committee. Hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. Okay, so going now to joint committees. Joint committees are kind of what they sound like, right? They're made up of both members of the House and of the Senate. So today's permanent joint committees, their responsibility is very almost somewhat similar to select committees, but a little bit different. But they're conducting studies, they're performing housekeeping tasks. The real big difference between a joint committee and a select committee, because you might be hearing they both conduct studies, what's the big difference? The huge difference is that on a joint committee, House and Senate members are sitting there working together one by one. So that's the big difference, the fact that you have the House and the Senate actually sitting together on a committee. That's what sets it aside from a select committee. So for instance, an example of this would be there's a joint committee on printing in our government, and they basically oversee the government publishing office and all the printing procedures of our government. So anything that has to do with like printing legislation, any federal registers that are printed by our government, there's a joint committee that oversees all of that. The chairmanship of joint committees, you're going to see it's going to alternate because usually if it's a House committee, the chair is a House member. If it's a Senate committee, the chair is a Senate member. If it's a joint committee and you have both House and Senate there, which one's it going to be? So for a joint committee, it's going to alternate between the House and the Senate. So it might be the House during one session will be a chairman, and during the next session of Congress, the chairperson will be a senator. And joint committees, they can be permanent or they can be temporary. And in the past, we've seen joint committees deal with the economy. We've seen them deal with taxation. The Library of Congress, we've also seen them deal with. So those are all kind of examples of what joint committees have done in the past and what they're there for. They really have no legislative dealings. They're really there performing a lot of housekeeping tasks, making sure that the government is functioning as far as its office duties, so to speak. And then again, conducting studies. So sometimes it's important for the House and the Senate to show teamwork and work together instead of working separately. You'll get more buy-in from people when they come together and work like that. And so here are just some joint committees we have in our country today. We have a joint economic committee, a joint committee on the library, a joint committee on printing, and a joint committee on taxation. And so basically, you know, for instance, a joint committee on taxation, you'll have senators and representatives come together to basically talk about the taxation policies in our country. They'll conduct studies with the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, to kind of look at if we change taxes, how is it going to impact the economy? How is it going to impact individuals? And they'll kind of conduct all these different studies and all this different research to be able to put out to the rest of Congress, who is then going to make the policies and the legislation, a lot of times based on some of the research that's being done in these joint committees. So that's kind of the purpose of the joint committees. But as far as legislative function, they don't really legislate. They're kind of there, again, doing those housekeeping details. But they're still important. I don't want to like try to make it seem like they're not important. to the way our government functions, because they are still very important. Maybe just not as important as the legislative committees that are doing more of the policy making. Questions before we move on? All right, so subcommittees. I've mentioned a couple times that there are subcommittees within our committees, and again, it's mostly the standing committees that will have subcommittees attached to them, and they're just going to be basically specializing a little bit more than you would necessarily see with a committee doing. So most committees are going to form subcommittees, and the subcommittees are basically responsible to work within whatever guidelines their main committee gave them. So a lot of times, standing committees will create these subcommittees to consider bills, to report on bills. It helps them to break down the workload that they have. They might tell their subcommittees like to do specific things, such as look at programs within the subcommittee's area. Subcommittees are super important because they are more specialized than committees. So if you think back again to those big standing committees we were talking about, where it's like education, health, and labor all together, right? So you might have former teachers, former workers, all these former people on this committee. But then when you go down to a subcommittee level, it could be more specialized. So if it is a bill pertaining to education, maybe that subcommittee is all former teachers, ideally. So that they have more influence and more say in what's going to happen with that bill. There's not a lot of rules for subcommittees as far as the amount of subcommittees, the amount of people who serve on subcommittees. That kind of differs from committee to committee. So it's when that standing committee is creating the subcommittee that they kind of, in a sense, come up with those rules. The Senate does kind of directly limit the number of subcommittees each committee can create. So for House rules, it's usually 5 subcommittees at the most for committees. But we'll see that like sometimes a House committee might have 6 subcommittees, but for the most part, they try to say don't go more than 5. In the Senate, it's usually a little bit smaller, but again, that just goes more towards the fact that the Senate staff isn't as large, so it's a little bit more difficult. But for instance, like in the House of Representatives, the Appropriations Committee, that's the committee that kind of deals with funding in general, which is a lot for our government. They have more subcommittees because of that. So they're the committee in the House that's going to have the most subcommittees, but it's just because they get so much workload. And so like the committees that tend to get more of the workload are the ones that are going to have more of the subcommittees. The subcommittees really have their own staff and budget. And when I say staff, I mean like senators and representatives will specifically hire people to serve as their staff members just for like that subcommittee role. And then if they're also on a committee, they'll have another staff just for that committee. So that way, again, their staff members can specialize in specific areas. A lot of times the committees will let the subcommittees take kind of a first swing at the bill, so to speak, just so that they can get initial consideration. They can kind of take the lead in framing the issues of the bill. They can hold hearings, markups, and all of that. And it, again, depends from committee to committee. There's no set rules that a committee has to send the bill to a subcommittee. There's no set rules that a committee has to let a subcommittee hold a hearing. It kind of depends on the bill, depends on the committee, depends on if they're trying to move this quickly, if they're trying to slow it down. So there's a lot of different factors that go into place. Even if a subcommittee kind of rules favorably, meaning, yay, we give this a thumbs up, we think it's a good thing, it doesn't mean that the full committee is going to say, yay, thumbs up, we think this is a good thing. And in order for the bill to make it to the full House or the full Senate, it needs to make it through the full committee. And in our country, 90% of our bills die in committee. Only about 10% make it out committee to make it to the full House, to make it to the full Senate, to then possibly be debated by everyone and passed to become a law. So the committee, really a lot of times, sometimes they decide not even to look at the bill. Sometimes they'll just throw it to the side and it dies automatically. Sometimes they will vote on the bill. and they'll vote against it, and then the bill dies. So the committee is actually a lot of people don't realize how valuable and important it is, because it's one of the hardest things to do, to get a bill out of committee. And if it makes it out of committee and makes it to the full floor of the House or the Senate, it has somewhat of a decent chance, but obviously still has to deal with the two political parties fighting over it. But so that's subcommittees as far as what their responsibilities are. Questions before we move into kind of the power of committees, which is going to be our last slide, and then we can delve into any longer type questions or what's going on in our country today, any of that good stuff. All right, so let's delve into then the power of committees. So the power of committees is really important. The House Rules Committee is probably one of the most powerful committees in Congress. It's only in the House of Representatives, and basically anytime a bill makes it out of committee, like out of one of the standing committees, before that bill can be debated on by the entire House of Representatives, it has to go through the House Rules Committee first. And that's why if you serve on the House Rules Committee, that's the only committee you're going to serve on, because any bill that's making it to the full floor of the House, you're going to have to deal with. And the whole purpose of the House Rules Committee, a lot of people refer to them as the gatekeepers, but they're the ones who determine for each specific bill in the House of Representatives how long it will be allowed to be debated on. So they set the time limit on the debate. They determine whether or not the bill can have amendments added to it. And so that's a huge power for this one committee to have. And it differs from bill to bill. So they could have one bill come before them, and they're like, yeah, 30 minutes of debate, that's it. No amendments are allowed to be added. Or they could have another bill, and they say, okay, for this bill, we're going to allow X amount of amendments. This is the amount of time we're going to allow for debate. It could be a little bit more. So that's a huge power that the House Rules Committee has, and that's why it's considered one of the most powerful committees in Congress. The Senate doesn't have a House Rules Committee just because the House, with over 400 members, they need more rules to kind of keep everyone in order. The Senate only has 100 members, so you'll see there tends to be less rules, especially around debate and how long they can debate. And that's why in the Senate, you'll see the filibuster and different things that can't take place in the House, just because the House has a lot stricter rules. And we'll actually, next week, I'm going to be doing one on how a bill becomes a law, and we'll get kind of more into that conversation about those rules when bills are going through a different process. Committees in general are known as little legislatures because they have the final say on pieces of legislation. And like I said before, 90% are going to die in committee. So if they say no to that bill, or they decide we're not even going to take a look or talk about this bill, then that's it. Bill is dead. It has no life after that. So that's why committees are really seen as being so powerful. The chairperson of each committee, the chairperson will come from the majority party. So right now in the House of Representatives, the Democrats are in the majority. So you'll see the chair of each standing committee in the House of Representatives will be a Democrat. In the Senate, where the Republicans are in the majority, you'll see that each member of the standing committees in the Senate, a Republican, will be the chairperson. And basically their responsibility is to kind of exercise control over the scheduling of hearings, the scheduling of how those hearings proceed. They're the ones who kind of give speaking time to each person who is on that committee. So if you watched any of the hearings that took place during Brett Kavanaugh's hearing, if you've watched any of the hearings that took place with Robert Mueller when he testified before Congress, you'll see that there was one person who was kind of recognizing all the different senators, and that is the chairperson who says, okay, Senator so-and-so, you may now speak. And the chairperson kind of sets all those different guidelines. It's the chairperson who will invite people to hearings, to talk in those hearings. So the chairperson, in a sense, has a great deal of power within those committees as well. And then they would be the one responsible for, if they decide a bill needs to go to a subcommittee, it would be the chairperson who decides which subcommittee it's going to go to, what exactly they want that subcommittee to be doing with the bill. And then the selection of committee members, I kind of touched upon this a little bit before. In the House, again, it's really the Speaker of the House and a committee of the majority party that kind of does those committee assignments. If you have a longer term of service on a standing committee, you're kind of given preferences in a sense. So usually if you look at a committee, the chairperson is usually from the majority party, and the person from that majority party who has served on that committee the longest. A lot of times they're the one who will become the chairperson. So you're not, again, going to see, even if they're from the majority party, you're not going to see freshmen in Congress being able to become the chairperson of a committee. They really use that seniority system when it comes to the chairperson position. And they do that for a couple different reasons. It's better to have somebody who kind of knows the rules and the ways of that committee, who's been there before, if they're going to be the one taking leadership of that committee, than kind of putting someone who's brand new into that role. That's a little bit more difficult. Any questions, though? This is kind of it as far as what I have as far as committees for us to talk about. But like I said, we can really delve into talking about as far as what committees are doing right now, if you've been paying attention to news as far as what's going on with possible impeachment articles. But I don't want to jump into that if there's any questions about committees over stuff I went over. So I'll give you all a second if you have a question. If not, I'm glad to talk about what's going on currently in our country and what the committees will be doing the next couple weeks. Okay, so basically what's going on in our country right now, in our country, for the impeachment process to take place, you need the House of Representatives to pass articles of impeachment. And even if the House of Representatives does pass articles of impeachment, a president can be impeached, and in the sense, but not removed from office, because then a trial takes place in the Senate, and you need 2/3 of the senators to vote guilty for that president to be removed from office. So we have had presidents who have been impeached technically. They've had articles of impeachment passed against them. They were just always found not guilty in the Senate, or one resigned before that trial in the Senate could take place. And so therefore, we've never had a president removed from office through the full impeachment process. Now, in this case, what's happening, because of this whistleblower complaint, and because of this phone call with the president from Ukraine, the Speaker of the House, who is the head of the House of Representatives, has given the order for committees to start investigating the president to see if the president violated his oath of office or the Constitution in some format. And so there's 6 different committees within the House of Representatives, 6 different standing committees that are currently looking into these allegations against the president. One of them being the Judiciary Committee. Another committee I know for sure that's investigating is the Finance Committee. And so basically what these committees are doing, they're looking at it from different lenses. So the Finance Committee is specifically going to be looking at it from a money lens. Was there any sort of money deals or anything offered that, again, would have violated the president's oath of office or our Constitution? The Judiciary Committee is more looking at it from the lens of, this is the role the president is supposed to play, this is the duty the president is supposed to have. Did the president do something that was shady, in a sense, or do something, again, to break that oath of office according to what it is he's supposed to be doing, or to violate our Constitution, again, according to what it is he's supposed to be doing? So it's going to be super interesting. One would think this would be cut and dry and super quick, but this will probably be dragged out for weeks and weeks and weeks. They have to do a lot of investigation. They will be conducting hearings, so you'll see different people being called before these committees. Tomorrow, the Director of National Intelligence, I believe, is coming to testify. There is a possibility that the person who filed the whistleblower account might come to testify as well. So there's going to be a lot that has to take place before then those committees might write up articles of impeachment. If the committees decide to write up articles of impeachment, it would then go to the full House. And like I said, there's 6 different committees investigating the president right now. All it takes is one committee writing up one article of impeachment for then it to go for the full House, for all members of the House of Representatives to vote whether or not that article of impeachment or articles of impeachment should be passed. So it's quite the process. It's not an easy process. Obviously, the Democrats are in the majority in the House of Representatives. But then if it did make it out of the House and made it to the Senate, you do have the Republicans in the majority there, and you do need 2/3 of the Senate to vote guilty in order for that president to be removed from office. In the House of Representatives, just to pass those articles of impeachment, you just need a simple majority for those articles of impeachment to be passed. So the Democrats, because they have a majority, if every single Democrat voted that way, it could happen. But right now, they haven't all come out saying exactly how it is that they're going to vote. I think the last count I saw, it was up to a little bit over 200 who felt confident that they would vote yes. But again, they really need to wait until this investigation is over. Nobody can jump to conclusions. The transcript from that phone call with the Ukrainian president was just released today, which you can read and access online. And again, that whistleblower account was just sent to Congress. So the intelligence committees are right now looking at it, and the Judiciary Committee, but no one else has really seen it. It hasn't been reported to the news what's in that whistleblower document. So it's going to be really super interesting. I mean, for someone who likes history or for who's studying government, whether you like the president or not, it's kind of a cool thing to watch. Just because this is history and our Constitution in action. So that's always, to see in your lifetime, that's a rare thing to see. So in that sense, it's kind of fascinating to watch how this all will play out. Any questions about anything that might be going on with that, or? So have you all studied already how a bill becomes a law, that you had kind of the basic concept of how a bill became a law down and had heard of committees before? Is this kind of all new? You haven't gotten to that part in your studies yet? This is kind of new. Okay. Yeah, it's definitely an overwhelming process. That's why if you do have a chance next week, either if you watch it live or you watch it on replay, we will be doing a live stream of how a bill becomes law, which really breaks it down a little bit more step by step. It makes it a little bit easier to understand. There'll be some cool charts and different things to look at. It's funny when you look at our Constitution. The legislative branch, which is our Congress, is Article 1 of our Constitution. It's the longest part of our Constitution. Our founding fathers put more emphasis into creating Article 1 than any other article in our Constitution, even more so than the executive branch, which is the president. And it's really because our founding fathers saw the soul of our government being our legislative branch. And so they made it very complicated, as you can tell. But they also made it this way for a reason too, right? We don't want to just be passing laws on the fly. I mean, sometimes it's frustrating how long it can take Congress to get things done. But there's also something good about that too, that there is this process of review and research and bringing in experts to discuss different topics. So we know, hopefully, that when a law is being put into place, it's been picked apart to no end. And the folks who are putting it into place really believe that that law is for the betterment of our country. People may disagree on different laws and different things like that, but there should be some sort of security, hopefully, in knowing the process that takes place. Any other questions, though, or comments, or anything you want me to just cover, or random questions you might have? Whether it's related to committees or not, maybe it's something else you're doing in class, I might possibly be able to answer it or not. This is my cat, Johnny, who's been bothering me this entire presentation. He keeps jumping on and off my lap. Pays me no attention until I'm doing this, and then he's my best friend. But anything else that you all want covered? Yeah. He has moments of cuteness. All right, so just to kind of rehash where we're going this week as far as AP government is concerned. So tomorrow night, it'll be talking about the different types of federalism. Tomorrow night at 8 o'clock, I'm back with the Constitutional Convention. I'm sure Johnny will be back as well. And then on Friday night, it's looking at the Congress and the differences between the House and the Senate, which there are a lot of differences. And so that's always an interesting question. I know AP Gov, the multiple choice questions, love to ask, put up little charts and everything about the differences between the House and the Senate. I just made a great test for my students that they're taking next week on that. So that's always a good one to check out Friday night. With the Constitutional Convention, we will get into more of the creation of our legislative branch, why it is the way it is, as far as only 100 senators, more representatives, what the whole purpose of that, and all the fun compromises that took place along the way at the Constitutional Convention, which is always interesting. Any questions, though, before, I can stay on and talk, or this one and I can check out, but I do want to answer questions if you all have any. All right, cool then. I think we're all set here. Feel free, though, to, again, look us up on social media, ask questions there. And then you can always go to the Bible site too. And we're always, that's live teachers, live people constantly asking questions. So you can always send your AP Gov questions through Bible, and we're more than happy to help you all out and answer them as best as we can. Thank you so much for participating tonight, Lisa and Allison. I hope this helped you all out in your studies. And join us again this week for some of our other sessions. Have an awesome night.